Today, we want to talk about the unique features of classic card design, features that, in our opinion, were the key reason behind Hearthstone's incredible success.
Time to rock and roll!
Hello my friends. My name is Bot Mathematician and this is Randomness.
Also, Chief Investigative Reporter Dora joined us this evening.
Gadgets and Gazette always gets the scoop.
The classic set, also known as the expert set, was the first type of card pack introduced with the launch of Hearthstone. It's been 11 years since then. Over 5,000 cards have been printed, and yet no other expansion, in our view, has surpassed the classic set in terms of design diversity and concentration of unique ideas.
The idea that classic Hearthstone was perfectly balanced and that most cards had a similar power level is a huge exaggeration. From the start, the game featured quite a few outrageously strong cards. To maintain a roughly uniform power level while still creating engaging mechanics, the developers had to rely on unconventional balancing techniques. And that, in my opinion, is what turned Hearthstone into a true phenomenon.
But despite this continuity, modern Hearthstone is a very different game compared to its classic origins. The key difference isn't in the sheer power of the effects, which have certainly grown more intense over time, but in the overall design philosophy, which has changed dramatically. This doesn't mean that modern Hearthstone is worse than the classic version, or vice versa. Both have their own strengths and weaknesses. But they are fundamentally different card games, driven by different ideologies.
Personally, I enjoy both versions of Hearthstone, but from a design standpoint, I find classic cards far more interesting. To be honest, I only recently came to appreciate their elegance. When we began experimenting with a benchmark system to evaluate card power, we needed a baseline to define the initial level of card effectiveness, and so we went deep into the analysis of basic and classic cards.
First and foremost, the set laid a solid foundation for the game's development. Despite the sheer number of new mechanics and keywords introduced over the years, almost all of them have conceptual predecessors in the classic set. For example, the imbue mechanic, though seemingly new, is actually a continuation of the shadow form concept. That classic priest spell didn't just replace the hero power, it allowed you to upgrade it by playing a second copy. Developers took that concept and expanded it into a full-blown synergy mechanic. That doesn't mean they've run out of fresh ideas, just that the classic set was incredibly comprehensive.
Here's what we mean. Lord Jaraxxus is truly a legendary card. He later became a prototype for incredibly powerful hero cards, but his original design reflected a completely different philosophy. First of all, the card offered a major long-term advantage, but only if you could survive long enough to make use of it. Most importantly, its powerful effect came with inconvenient activation conditions. The card would set your hero's health to 15, so you had to time it carefully to minimize harm, or even turn it into an advantage if your health was already low. In the best-case scenario, it acted as a heal. In the worst case, it was effectively the same as taking free mind blasts to the face. You'd gain an insanely strong hero power, essentially equivalent to casting Shadow Form 5 times, but you couldn't use it immediately. The only thing you could activate right away was the weapon, which, by base standards, had a nominal cost of 8 mana crystals. In practice, the Warlock had to skip a turn in the late game and take a huge risk, hoping to extract immense value later on.
Actually, there was always a strong chance you'd get no value at all, especially in matchups where the Warlock never had a window to play the card and it just sat in hand, clogging up space.
Taking all factors into account, our benchmark showed that Jaraxxus had a utility ratio of only 1.2. That means that despite its enormous potential, the card was only about 20% stronger than the baseline on average. Its usefulness could spike in control matchups, but drop sharply against aggressive opponents. It was incredibly powerful, but also extremely situational. A similar design philosophy applied to Alexstrasza. She was both a healer and a damage dealer, depending on the situation. In the best-case scenario, you could heal yourself for 14 health to escape death, or deal up to 15 damage to an opponent at full health. But just like Lord Jaraxxus, this card could be extremely awkward. If your opponent was already below 15 health by turn 9, and you were above it, the card could become a dead weight in your hand, something that was a great drawback in classic Hearthstone. I often found myself forced to play her at a disadvantage, taking the hit to my own health just to get a strong body on the board, and to avoid healing my opponent. It was exactly this need for compromise that made the gameplay deeper, and at the same time, more challenging.
Now compare this card to the new version of Alexstrasza. The effect remains similar, healing an ally or damaging an opponent, but it no longer requires any risks or compromises. The card has a swing effect, which is a core part of the turnaround mechanic. You can eliminate a threat while simultaneously creating your own or dealing critical damage to the opponent. It's one of the most powerful effects in the game. The new version of the card has consistently found a place in combo decks, often serving as a reliable finisher. As a result, the updated Alexstrasza is reactive, flexible, and highly versatile, but most importantly, it embodies a completely different design philosophy.
Dear friends, before we continue, we'd like to ask you a small favor. If you find this topic interesting, please leave a like. If you'd like to see a continuation of this review or a retrospective on old cards from later expansions, let us know in the comments.
When talking about swing effects with unusual design, we must mention Big Game Hunter.
Whoopsie!
The card is cleverly implemented. It sits in ambush, waiting for its prey. The catch, however, is that to trigger the effect, the target must have at least 7 attack. That means in many games, the card could be a dead draw, occupying space that could have gone to a more universally useful card. In our calculations, the probability of such a scenario was around 35%. But in situations where a target was present, Big Game Hunter could completely flip the board state. It activated an effect that partially resembled Shadow Word Death. In this case, your potential value was worth 6 mana for the 3 mana investment. You'd eliminate a major threat and summon your own, albeit weaker and more vulnerable one. It was a strong effect by classic standards, but the situational nature of the requirement helped balance it perfectly.
But not all classic cards had this kind of depth. For instance, the basic card Fire Elemental delivered guaranteed value under almost any condition. You could deal damage to the enemy hero or destroy an enemy minion, often enough to count as a swing effect. It didn't have the ceiling to generate phenomenal value, but its strength lay in consistency and predictability. These reactive cards were a key part of classic gameplay, though they mostly served to define the unique flavor of each class.
Concluding the discussion of swing and turnaround mechanics, we must bring up Deathwing, an incredibly powerful card that combines the effects of Twisting Nether with the summoning of a massive minion.
But it also came with brutal consequences. The player could discard up to 9 cards from their hand. Playing Deathwing was a desperate move, often a last-ditch effort to win the game. If the opponent found a way to answer it, such as with Big Game Hunter, your chances of victory would plummet due to a lack of remaining resources. But if the gamble paid off, the downsides could be completely ignored. Additionally, the card had other built-in balancing mechanisms. Its extreme cost would clog up a hand slot all the way until turn 10. Drawing it in your opening hand often lowered your win rate, especially against aggressive decks. On top of that, death rattle effects on enemy minions could create additional problems, adding more situational risks. The combined drawbacks, high cost, and the nature of the classic meta created important restrictions that kept the card from dominating. Now compare this classic card to its new reincarnation, the Ceaseless Expanse. It offers a similar effect, sometimes for 0 mana, with no compromises and no downside. Unsurprisingly, this card came to dominate the meta. Even after 2 rounds of nerfs, it still holds a prominent place in competitive decks and significantly boosts win rates for certain archetypes. From a game design standpoint, these 2 cards may share a surface-level effect, but they are from entirely different philosophical universes.
Let's now talk about cards that reflect another design philosophy. Here's a riddle for you. Which classic card had an effect that was 4 times more powerful than its mana cost? It sounds unbelievable given the generally low power level of early cards, but the effect was carefully balanced in a very unusual way.
Here's a hint. It's an iconic card you know very well. In fact, it's my personal favorite from the entire set. Time to reveal the answer.
The end is coming!
Doomsayer is one of the wildest cards ever printed. Depending on the situation, it can serve as a protector or a full board removal tool. But what's unique is that the final outcome is left in the hands of your opponent. The opponent could prevent the board wipe, for example by redirecting damage from your hero to the minion. A large health pool on enemy minions could act like a form of healing, reducing overall incoming damage. On the other hand, the opponent could simply ignore Doomsayer and try to go for lethal next turn using a charge minion or a spell. In such scenarios, the value of the card dropped to 0. The absence of a taunt effect meant that its protective value was never guaranteed and allowed the opponent full agency in how to respond. That said, Doomsayer often succeeded in activating its effect, especially in the early game when its power could be overwhelming, or when paired with additional control tools. However, due to the delayed activation and the opponent's ability to influence the outcome, the card could never offer 100% guaranteed results. It's a perfect example of how Hearthstone combined insane power with the opponent's right to decide its outcome.
A similar design principle can be found in Acolyte of Pain. Theoretically, the card could draw up to 4 cards, 1 for each point of health. But the opponent's primary task was to minimize your potential advantage, sometimes even completely shutting off the draw by using removal or silence effects. In real scenarios, you'd typically draw 1 to 2 cards unless you had a way to trigger the effect yourself during your turn. Another powerful card with an unusual balancing method, it introduced unpredictable outcomes and created opportunities to explore unexpected synergies.
The new Tortola legendary card is a spiritual successor to these classic ideas, but partially adapted for the modern meta through the elusive keyword. The opponent still gets to influence the card's value, though not through most spells.
Another insanely powerful and game-defining mechanic was stealing an enemy minion. The iconic face of this effect was Sylvanas Windrunner. Realistically, taking control of an enemy minion was like combining 3 cards: Faceless Manipulator, Silence, and Assassinate. In terms of value, that's effectively mind control. The value this offered was absurd for just 6 mana, especially during the low-power classic era. But there was an important factor balancing it all: randomness. The Death Rattle effect targeted a random enemy minion, and since it was a Death Rattle, the opponent had the ability to interfere. They could trade minions smartly to reduce your advantage or force a suboptimal steal. So while the chance of getting exactly what you wanted was low, the likelihood of getting something was quite high. This created a strong card with widely varying value, heavily influenced by your opponent's actions and the board state. Now compare this to the new version of Sylvanas. The updated card is flexible and completely predictable. It offers guaranteed minimum value and, upon activating the extra effect, lets you steal a specific enemy minion instantly. No randomness, no delay. It's no longer a situational play, but a consistent control tool. Once again, despite having nearly the same effect, the design philosophies behind each version feel like they come from completely different universes.
That said, classic Hearthstone did feature a reactive card with a similar effect: Mind Control Tech. It had a cheaper cost and could trigger immediately, but with one big catch. The opponent needed to have at least 4 minions on board. This meant the opponent had agency over whether the card could activate just by not overcommitting. I remember the tension of having to factor in the possibility of this card being in my opponent's hand. That, in my view, is a brilliant example of a card influencing games even when it wasn't actually played.
One of the most defining traits of classic Hearthstone was randomness. It wasn't just a balancing tool for powerful effects. It brought chaos, fun, and unforgettable moments.
And no card embodied randomness quite like Ragnaros the Firelord. With an insane swing effect tied into turnaround potential, Ragnaros could theoretically take out a huge enemy threat and simultaneously establish a massive one of your own. But in practice, its power was regulated by RNG. Its value fluctuated based on the board state and your luck. Worse still, the card couldn't attack directly, meaning you were at the mercy of randomness turn after turn. I'd say in about 20% of cases you'd hit the ideal target and get maximum value, but the chance of hitting one of the worst options was always higher. Smart opponents could even nullify the card's impact by filling their board with smaller minions, reducing the chances of Ragnaros hitting anything meaningful. Still, it was a card that delivered some of the game's most iconic and hilarious moments.
The strongest classic cards were often much harder to execute effectively. They didn't guarantee optimal value, but that's exactly what made them more rewarding and strategically deep.
I truly believe that without this unique approach to balancing powerful effects, Hearthstone wouldn't have become the phenomenon it is.
The developers didn't strive for sterile, perfect balance. Instead, they embraced unpredictability, fun, and gameplay depth. And the cards that captured all 3 of those qualities became true icons of the game.
This video isn't meant to claim that the past was better. Rather, it's a reflection that the past was different, and I really miss that feeling. At the same time, I'm not saying that the modern standard format should revert completely to the classic philosophy.
We believe in diverse gameplay experiences, and the more varied they are, the better.
But it's incredibly disheartening to see the game's leadership completely ignore its legacy. We once had the classic format, not a massive hit, but it clearly sparked interest at launch. Unfortunately, due to a wave of bots and a complete lack of further development, players lost interest far too quickly.
Then came the Twist format, meant to replace Classic. It never even came close to matching the player engagement of its predecessor. The gameplay experience was heavily distorted by the sheer number of sets thrown together with poor synergy, and the release of the disastrous Caverns of Time expansion only made things worse. Now, support for the Twist format has essentially been dropped, just like another mode, Duels. While Duels didn't reflect the classic design philosophy, it did offer players a wild and refreshing alternative. The removal of these alternate modes has significantly reduced the diversity of available experiences.
I still hold on to hope that a discussion about classic design principles within the community might open a window for the return of either classic or twist, this time in a more traditional and thoughtful form. That's why your feedback truly matters.
Dear viewers, what do you think? Is the classic Hearthstone experience important to you? Which classic card is your all-time favorite?
Let us know your thoughts below and join the polls in your community tab. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to support our content and stay updated.
Traditionally, we want to express our boundless gratitude to our sponsors.
Dear friends, your help is invaluable. We will be grateful for any support.
Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for spending this time with us. We really hope that we will have the opportunity to get in touch in the next video.
Take care of yourself.
And never give up.
Job's done.